Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke media briefing on racial justice in America. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications. It's sometimes claimed the US is a post-racial society, but for every dollar held by the average US white household, the average black household owns just 10 cents. With us today to discuss how that wealth gap came about, why it persists, and what can be done to bridge it is Professor William Sandy Darity. He is a professor of public policy, African and African American studies, and economics at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy, and also directs the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity. Professor Darity, good morning.
Good morning.
Professor Darity is also co-author of the new book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, written together with folklorist and arts consultant Kirsten Mullen. The book inspired a new podcast, The Arc of Justice, that launched this week. Okay, Professor Darity, we'll jump right in here with the obvious question. What exactly are reparations and why do they make sense in America?
We define reparations as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. By acknowledgement, we mean that the culpable party, the party that has engineered the atrocities, admits that they have done so, and then proceeds to say that they're going to make a commitment to engage in an act of restitution for it. Redress is the act of restitution, and historically, in the context of other initiatives for reparations, redress has frequently taken the form of monetary payments to the victimized community or the members of the victimized community. A couple of illustrations are pertinent here. One is the German government's payments to victims of the Holocaust. And a second example is closer to home in the United States, where the US government made payment to the Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II, internally incarcerated, subjected to mass incarceration. So the second dimension is redress. The third dimension is closure. And what closure means is that the culpable party and the victimized community come to an agreement that the debt has been paid, that the count is settled. And the victimized community will make no further claims for restitution on the culpable party unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or a new wave of atrocities takes place. But otherwise, the docket is finalized. So that's what we mean by reparations. Now, in the US context, when we start to think about the case for reparations that is specific to Black Americans who were descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, folks frequently want to associate that case for reparations exclusively with the horrors of slavery. But the case that we make in our book, From Here to Equality, is one that is inclusive of two other phases of American history. So, of course, we start with slavery as the foundation for the conditions that we're going to describe as taking place today, affecting the living descendants today. But the second phase that's pertinent is nearly 100 years of legal segregation in the United States, what we colloquially refer to as the Jim Crow period. And this is a period in which not only was an apparatus of apartheid established on a legal basis in the United States, but we also had a series of massacres that took place. White massacres that took place north and south, east and west from the end of the Civil War into the 1940s. These massacres resulted in the massive loss of Black lives, but also, and this is pertinent to a point that I'm going to make about the wealth gap that you mentioned in a moment or two, that also there was either the destruction of Black property or there was a situation in which the Black-owned property was actually seized by the white mobsters. So that's the second phase. And then the third phase is the period in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, in which we have a sustained array of atrocities, including mass incarceration of Black Americans, police executions of unarmed Blacks. We have ongoing discrimination in credit, housing, and employment. And then most significant from the standpoint of what we see as the agenda for a reparations plan an enormous gap in wealth between blacks and whites in the United States. And this gap in wealth is fully captured by the fact that Black Americans constitute approximately 13% of the nation's population, but possess only about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. This corresponds to a condition where the average Black household in the United States has $840,000 less in net worth than the average white household. And so as a consequence, there is this gaping chasm in opportunity and in the capability to participate in the society. And there's ultimately a denial of access to the material conditions for full citizenship in the United States. And so we think that this wealth gap is what should be the primary target of a reparations initiative, that any well-designed reparations plan for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery must be designed to eliminate the racial wealth differential. And one final point that's relevant here is the fact that we are convinced that the racial wealth gap begins in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised as restitution for their years of bondage, while at the same time, the United States government, under the aegis of the Homestead Acts, was providing 160-acre land grants to 1.5 million white families in the western part of the United States as the nation completed its colonial settler project. And I would add here that the consequences have been intergenerational. There are approximately 45 million living white Americans who are beneficiaries of the land grants that were made to their ancestors, while Black Americans received nothing.
Thank you, Professor Darity. There's obviously far more here than we can cover in 30 minutes, but we're going to do our best. Obviously, there are some popular and common arguments against reparations that I want to get into, but I want to start by going back to, you mentioned obviously that slavery is not the only reason we need reparations. There's been more than a century of policy since then, but that's what kind of put us on the path. And you look back to this, and I was wondering if you could tell us, in the first episode of your podcast, you talk about the US failure to deconfederatize. Can you tell us what that means and why it's important and how it put us on the path to where we are today?
So in Germany, there was a process of what we might refer to as denazification. That is the removal of any kinds of celebratory tributes to the Nazi Party. In the United States, the Confederacy was fundamentally an act of traitorship against the Republic, but we have a vast array of memorials that exist for figures in the Confederacy, figures who are portrayed as being heroic individuals or individuals of great dignity and worth. And as a consequence, we have, in a sense, celebrated the Confederacy. One could argue that even though the Confederacy lost the war, the Confederacy, some people say, won the peace, in the sense that it's the Confederate followers who have actually written the history of slavery, Reconstruction, and the Civil War itself, to such an extent that people actually have very, very false impressions about what actually took place. And so deconfederatization would require a reconstruction of American history in such a way that we tell the true story of what actually occurred, particularly in the period of enslavement during the Civil War itself and during the Reconstruction era that followed the war. I will note that the failure to deconfederatize was central to the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised. There was an order that was issued by General Sherman in January 1865, after meeting with a group of Black leaders who informed him that what the freedmen actually needed was land and to be left alone. In the immediate aftermath of that meeting, Sherman issued Special Field Orders number 15, where he allots 5.3 million acres of land along the Atlantic coast, stretching from the South Carolina Sea Islands to northern Florida, bordered by the St. Johns River. And this 5.3 million acres of land was supposed to be the first installment of a full allotment that was supposed to go to the 4 million formerly enslaved. That full allotment would have amounted to at least 40 million acres. But what actually happened? Well, only 400,000 acres were actually settled by about 40,000 of the formerly enslaved. And even that amount of land, that small amount of the 5.3 million acre total, was taken back, and it was restored to the former slaveholders. And this act was taken by President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered. And Johnson was completely inclined to undermine the Reconstruction efforts to bring Black Americans full citizenship. And he was, unfortunately, despite the kinds of actions he took during his period in the state of Tennessee, resisting the Confederates, he ultimately joined with them in terms of trying to restore them to glory in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Thank you, Professor Darity. I've got another enormous question for you, but it's one that you touched on briefly in your opening, and it's a comment you make in your book. Federal policy lies at the heart of the racial wealth disparity that we observe today. Can you talk a little bit about some of the federal policies that you mentioned at this point that are legal? They're part of the system that perpetuate the wealth gap that persists.
Yes, and the argument that we're making is that the wealth gap that we observe today is the cumulative intergenerational effect of racial injustice in the United States. And so the starting point, as I mentioned, is the failure to provide Black Americans who are emerging from enslavement with the 40-acre land grants that they were promised, while white Americans in large numbers are receiving land grants in the western part of the United States that were 4 times as large as the 40 acres that was promised to the newly emancipated persons. So that's the first phase of policy. The second phase of policy is associated with the failure to provide the types of resources that a social movement that emerged towards the end of the 19th century was demanding, which were pensions for the formerly enslaved, essentially retirement accounts for the formerly enslaved, comparable to the types of pensions that were provided to individuals who had served in the Union Army, and as well as pensions that were actually given to individuals who had served in the Confederate Army. So the formerly enslaved were asking for pensions to support them in their old age. And Callie House, a woman who made her living by taking in laundry, became the leader of this movement. She developed a petition where 300,000 formerly enslaved individuals were signatories. This petition was delivered to Congress, but it was ignored, and Callie House was actually subverted by federal action. She was brought down on mail fraud charges, the same types of charges that were used against Marcus Garvey after her. But again, it's federal policy. In this particular case, it's once again like the 40 acres. It's an instance in which the federal government doesn't do anything. There's another important instance in which the federal government doesn't take action, and that's in the midst of these massacres that I described that took place between the end of the Civil War into the 1940s. There were upwards of about 100 of these. In the year 1919 alone, there were close to 35 of these massacres that took place in locations ranging from Elaine, Arkansas, to Chicago, Illinois, to Washington, D.C., to Omaha, Nebraska. The most famous of these massacres probably is, as a consequence in part of the television program, The Watchmen, the most famous of these is probably the Tulsa Massacre. In the North Carolina context, the most significant massacre is the one that took place in Wilmington in 1898. But these massacres were never prosecuted. There was no attempt to bring the perpetrators to bear, and furthermore, in many instances, the perpetrators appropriated property that was owned by Black Americans, made it their own, and further accumulated their own wealth in the process. In the 20th century, federal asset building policy shifts away from a focus on land acquisition to home ownership. And the process of policymaking supporting home ownership efforts in the 20th century was tilted grossly in favor of whites to the disadvantage of blacks. Two pieces of legislation that are of particular note is the New Deal legislation that introduced the Federal Housing Administration and the post-World War II legislation to support returning veterans, the GI Bill. In both instances, a tremendous amount of discretion was left to local authorities, and nationwide there was a tendency to provide the benefits of those pieces of legislation overwhelmingly to white Americans to the disadvantage of Black Americans. One of the most extreme examples is the state of Mississippi, where out of 3,000 returning veterans from World War II who received the home buying benefits of the GI Bill, only 2 were Black Americans.
Thank you, Professor Darity. That's a very stark point to end that comment on. Obviously, the discussion about reparations has been ongoing in this country for a long time without getting far enough for it to actually happen. And one of the common arguments against it, especially used at a time like this with everything that's going on, is that it's too expensive. What's your response to that?
I think that, the how will we pay for it argument is one that is always thrown up as an obstacle against transformative policies. People don't usually raise that question when we're thinking about matters like defense spending and the like. But I think that our recent experience, both in the Great Recession and in the midst of the pandemic, suggests that it's quite clear that the federal government can make substantial expenditures without necessarily raising taxes on anyone. The expenditures that took place in response to the Great Recession were expenditures that were made without any significant change in the tax intake. And the expenditures that were made under the CARES Act and what I presume will be the next round, albeit too sporadic, of $1,400 payments rather than $2,000 payments, that those expenditures are going to be made without raising taxes as well. So the federal government has a tremendous spending capacity because it has the sovereign currency. Its situation is different from an individual household. Its situation is different from a municipal or a state government. It uniquely has control over the national currency, and so it has the capacity to engage in the spending. The only barrier of any significance to increased federal spending is the risk of inflation. And as a consequence, it becomes important to design any new expenditure program in such a way that you minimize the risk of inflation. And in the final chapter of our book, we attempt to do exactly that in terms of how we design or describe an appropriate reparations program for Black American descendants of persons enslaved in the United States.
Thank you. Yes, it certainly seems to be the case that when the will is there, the American government can come up with money for whatever it wants to spend it on. I should add that we can take questions. You can post questions in the Q&A window at any time if you would like, or raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you so you can ask your question that way. Professor Darity, much as I hate to ask you to gaze into a crystal ball, Congress is considering a bill to study reparations, and the Biden administration has expressed support for that bill. How hopeful are you that there could actually be some significant movement on this issue anytime soon?
I'm not really sure. I will say that there are signs that this is a more propitious moment than others. If I go back to the year 2000, the first year of the new century, I can say that there was a study that was undertaken by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popoff at the University of Chicago, where they actually surveyed Americans about their attitudes towards reparations. And they found at that time that only 4% of white Americans endorsed reparations for Black Americans. About 2 years ago, a similar survey was undertaken, and the evidence suggested that about 16% of white Americans then endorsed reparations for Black Americans. And then a survey taken by the organization Civics in June 2020 actually suggests that the percentage is closer to 30. So there is political momentum that is emerging in support of reparations, although there's a substantial majority that still is in opposition. But it seems like the direction is moving in the right way. I will say this, the legislation that you mentioned, H.R. 40 for a study commission, is something that is not something that I view as particularly promising as a route towards true reparations, because it's a legislation that has a tremendous number of weaknesses. And there has never been a congressional hearing in which the actual text of the bill has been subjected to intense scrutiny and criticism. So my feeling is that that bill could be useful if it was revised or replaced with something that was superior. The idea of having a study commission is certainly a good one. There was such a commission that was a prelude to the Japanese American reparations. And that commission was known as the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. But it was a commission that did a terrific job. And I think we need legislation that would ensure that a commission that is investigating Black American reparations does a terrific job as well. The current legislation doesn't assure that.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. Your recent research suggests that reparations could actually help all Americans and not just necessarily the recipients of payments of those reparations. Could you talk a little bit about what you found and how that could work?
I think you're referring to the research that we did on the potential health effects of having had a reparations program in place before the pandemic took hold. And if so, the argument that we're making is if you can reduce the infection rates and the mortality rates in a large segment of the population that performs a significant amount of frontline work, whether it's well paid or whether it's poorly paid, but frontline work, essential workers who then are coming into contact with other Americans in the society, that you can reduce the overall infection rate and the overall mortality rate. And so what we argue is, had we had reparations in place, the health conditions of Black Americans would have been substantially different in the midst of the pandemic. A couple of reasons that I'd highlight is the fact that Black Americans have displayed greater vulnerability to the disease, in large part because of the presence of what we refer to now as pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions associated with a greater incidence of hypertension, diabetes, and other types of related illnesses that make people more susceptible to infection and also more susceptible to severe consequences from the infection. If Black Americans had had a higher level of wealth at the outset, it's more likely that Black Americans also would have had lower levels of these pre-existing conditions, and so lesser vulnerability to the disease. A second dimension that we highlight is the fact that folks who are subjected to living in overcrowded conditions are more likely to transmit the disease. And if Black Americans had a higher level of wealth, they would not be disproportionately subjected to overcrowded living conditions. And so not only would you lower the spread of the disease within the Black community, but you would lower the spread of the disease across the entire American population. So from that standpoint, a reparations program would have been beneficial to the health outcomes of the entire nation. And it would have been very, very helpful to have had such a program in place prior to the pandemic. But there's nothing that stops us from doing it now. And we could have attendant benefits in the future, particularly if we have a new pandemic, which is always a possibility.
Absolutely. And yes, that is the research I was referring to. So thank you for picking up on that. You mentioned a couple of minutes ago that in the final chapter of your book, you discuss how a program could actually work. Could you talk a little bit about that proposal, or what a reparations program could actually look like?
There are three central dimensions of the reparations program that we propose in the final chapter of our book. The first dimension is who would be eligible to receive the reparations payments. And we propose two standards or criteria for eligibility. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard, which is an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And then the second criteria is what we refer to as an identity standard. And so for at least 12 years before the enactment of a reparations plan or the enactment of a study commission for reparations, whichever comes first, an individual would have had to have self-identified on an official document as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. And then the second dimension of the program is it must be designed in such a way that it eliminates the racial wealth differential in the United States. That is to say, it closes that $840,000 gap in net worth between the average Black family and the average white family. And this would require an expenditure, we estimate, of at least $10 to $12 trillion to execute it. So that should be the baseline amount of the reparations plan. And then the third dimension of the reparations plan must be the way in which the funds are distributed. And we argue that in concert with previous efforts at conducting reparations, there should be direct payments to eligible recipients, that should be the core dimension of how the funds are dispersed. So I think those are the three central elements of the reparations plan that we describe in chapter 13 of our book.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. And in addition to direct payments, does your proposal include anything about kind of investments in majority Black communities and historically underfunded programs that have been directed towards those communities?
So that's certainly a possibility, but it would be above and beyond the direct payments. And we have some reservations about relying on place-based policies rather than person-based policies, particularly in an environment in which communities are not stable and we have high rates of gentrification. So our preference is for a person-based emphasis over a place-based emphasis, but if that was a secondary or tertiary dimension of a reparations plan, that's fine.
Sure, absolutely. Coming back to the point you made about your research into the pandemic and how reparations could have limited the outbreak there. Beyond that, do you think that non-Black Americans should support reparations as a matter of justice, or would you argue that reparations could benefit the nation as a whole?
So I think there's definitely a benefit to the nation as a whole from an ethical or moral standpoint. And I think that as a justice claim, that's the fundamental reason why reparations should be supported. There's some ambiguity over what the consequences would be for the economy as a whole. There are some people who've argued that this could be an enormous stimulus to the economy. I'm not certain. So I don't want to hang my hat on an argument that everybody will benefit from reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. The key point is that there is a debt that has been unpaid for 156 years, and that debt has had ramifications for the quality of life of living descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States and the Black community. And so that's the reason. The nation has an obligation, has a debt that needs to be paid. And I can't really say whether or not it would have an all-around benefit for every single American to do this.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. We're getting close to time, but I'm going to try and get a few more questions in here. There's a very common sense and claim in America with this self-made country that Americans will say they are self-made and they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. How do you respond to that? Because that's often used as an argument against programs like reparations.
So I would say that folks should investigate very carefully their personal family histories before they make that assertion. So how many families are families that actually benefited from slaveholding? How many families actually received land grants through the Homestead Act? Jennifer Mueller, a researcher at Skidmore College, actually ran an exercise when she had a class of 150 students at Texas A&M University. She asked them to go back and look at their own family's past. And she found that 1/3 of the white students in the class, and they were the overwhelming majority of the students in the class, 1/3 of them came back and reported that their families had actually been recipients of Homestead Act land grants. I would like to ask people to explore the extent to which their families received home buying support from the Federal Housing Administration or through the GI Bill. I think that there's a number of ways in which we must disrupt this myth that everybody has pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. They've been given substantial support from the federal government. One could even describe the Homestead Acts as a form of federal handouts, if you wish. I don't want to be pejorative. I wish that those handouts had been given to Black Americans also, and that's the key issue. They weren't.
Absolutely. And I would add to that linguists have found that the origins of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps was to be able to do something impossible, because when you think about it, it's physically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's one of those phrases we say without thinking about it. We're going to wrap up here very shortly. One other question I had for you is that, are you concerned at all that if reparations were to come about, because it's designed to bring some sort of closure, that would prompt more people to say, well, there isn't any kind of systemic inequity now, it's all been fixed because there were payments, when in fact, we know that there's lots of evidence of systemic racism in systems across the US. Does it run the potential for that to be left unchecked?
I think there's a really valuable quotation from Malcolm X that we report in our book, where Malcolm X talks about a situation where somebody has plunged a knife into his back 9 inches. And he makes a distinction between the knife being pulled out and the wound being healed. And so from our perspective, the kinds of structural conditions, structural racism conditions that need to be altered are the equivalent of pulling the knife out. But reparations is a form of compensation for the harm that was done by the knife being plunged in, and that's what constitutes healing the wound. And we need to have both happen. We need to eliminate or stop the kinds of policies that are producing ongoing damages, but we also need to compensate the community that has been subjected to these harms for those damages, because the damages have ramifications in their day-to-day lives now.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think we'll call it there. We can certainly talk about these issues all day and not resolve them, but this has been terrific. Thank you so much, Professor Sandy Darity, for sharing your perspective. I would urge everyone to find the Arc of Justice podcast, which you can find at waysandmeansshow.org. It is a difficult listen, not only for the descendants of enslaved people, but also, as it should be, for those of us who still benefit from the echoes of that system. Next week, we'll be returning to the topic of COVID-19 and what it has taught scientists about disease transmission from animals to humans and why that's important to preventing future pandemics. We're having regular media briefings here on the pandemic and on social justice. If you would like to be notified about them, please do email dukenews@duke.edu. Thank you for joining us. Check out the Arc of Justice podcast. In the meantime, stay well, wear a mask, wash your hands, and get vaccinated when your turn comes. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.